My name is Caitlin Reed. I'm an assistant professor of Native American Studies at Humboldt State University and a member of the Yurok tribe. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we dive into the program, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to all of you from Wiyot lands today. Wiyot peoples continue to remain in relationship to these lands through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. They are important parts of not only the history of this area, but in the continuing knowledge of this place, the future of this place. If you don't know whose land you're on right now, I encourage you to go find out, educate yourself about the history of the place you live, familiarize yourself with the work that those tribal peoples are doing and how you can support that work. All right, let's get to it. I'm very excited to moderate today's panel discussion called The River Feeds Us, Food Sovereignty and Community Resilience. Today, our panel is going to examine the centrality of Indigenous relationships to food systems and the importance of food sovereignty for tribal nations. Additionally, we'll reflect on the ways in which Native peoples are currently working towards food sovereignty in their respective areas and how these goals are critically interconnected with water policy in California. We have a highly esteemed panel of presenters for you today. I'm going to briefly introduce all of them right now, but I encourage our panelists to say a few more words about themselves as you begin your presentation if you would like to. Our first speaker today will be Hillary Rennick. She is an alumni of the Indigenous Food Initiative at the University of Arkansas as an LLM fellow in agriculture and food law with support from First Nations. She received her JD from the University of the Oregon School of Law with certificates of completion in environmental and natural resources, ocean and coastal law, pro bono, and public service. She was a research assistant for Professor Mary Christina Wood, researching nature's trust and public trust doctrine as it relates to climate change, while working with Oregon's 9 tribes on water and environmental related issues. She also completed graduate studies in cultural resource management as a Bureau of Reclamation Fellow at Central Washington University, successfully defending her master's thesis on Yakima Indian treaty fishing and significance of traditional places. She studied public health at George Washington University, assisting Dr. David Goldsmith with his research on Native American health problems associated with exposure to agricultural pesticides in agriculture and during artifact repatriation. Hillary received her BA in anthropology from American University in Washington, D.C., and is an enrolled member of the Sherwood Valley Band of Pomo Indians and descendant of the Hopeland-Chanel, Noyo River Indian, and Fort McDermott Paiute Shoshone communities. I hope I said all of your communities right, Hillary. Hillary's work is focused on land, air, water, cultural resources, and traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering protections. Wow, what an array of accomplishments. Our second speaker is Megan Baldy. Megan is the Klamath Trinity Resource Conservation District Coordinator. She is a Hoopa tribal member and resides on the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation in Northern California. She is the coordinator of a tribal nonprofit established under the Hoopa Valley Tribe's Sovereign Business Codes, and the KTRCD promotes food security within homes and food sovereignty initiative within the tribe and reservation boundaries. I will also just briefly say Megan has an amazing YouTube channel that I love watching, Cooking Healthy in Indian Country, that everybody should go watch. It's phenomenal. And our final speaker today is Cody Hendrickson. He is of the Outer Inlet, Dena'ina, and Sugpiaq descent and an enrolled member of the Ninilchik Village Tribe in the Great Land of Alaska. Cody is a senior undergraduate at Humboldt State University, double majoring in marine biology and Native American studies, with a focus in Indigenous food sovereignty. Cody is a member of the steering committee for Humboldt State University's Indigenous Food Sovereignty Lab and is an active participant in its creation. His passions for the ocean, food sovereignty, and his tribe have led him to professional goals of creating and managing marine aquaculture systems in his home state of Alaska. Cody hopes that in doing so, he may provide economic growth, stability, and a source of food sovereignty and research opportunities for his people and his community. Oh, cool. I'm very excited for today's panel. But I'm going to talk just a little bit longer at all of you. And I'm going to briefly introduce the concept of what Indigenous food sovereignty means for people who are unfamiliar with that term. And this way our presenters can just dive straight into the work that they do without having to explain what food sovereignty is. So let me share my screen with you all. This is our lovely poster for today. First things we need to talk about is settler colonialism and Indigenous foods. Native peoples had an amazing knowledge of how to harvest, gather, collect, and steward food sources. And we had very important relationships with our food sources. Okay, this idea of like nomadic hunter-gatherer, like walking around just grabbing a berry here and a berry there, right, is very simplistic. It depicts Native peoples as primitive, and this helps justify land dispossession. Right? In reality, Native peoples had complex knowledge systems about how to work with food systems. So as a part of settler colonialism, which is a structure designed to dispossess indigenous peoples of their lands and then create the new owners of that land, right? Attacking food sources was incredibly important. And so this helps explain why indigenous peoples need to reconnect with food sources. And so there's the deliberate and unintentional destruction of indigenous food sources. If you eliminate a people's ability to feed themselves, they become dependent, right? And so the US military was given orders to systematically eradicate buffalo, right? Not all destructions of indigenous food sources was as clearly deliberate, because this is like they got an order from the US military. There's not much more deliberate than that. But also unintentional destructions, right? So when miners show up in California, when the Spanish missionaries show up in California, they bring a ton of livestock that have hooves that completely destroy all of these roots and tubers and bulbs and plants that we depend on as food species, right? And so food is destroyed in multiple ways. Some of it is deliberate and intentional in a form of genocide. Some is unintentional by the economic activities that settlers want to do in this new place. Okay. Additionally, land dispossession via removal, allotment, and relocation prevents Native peoples from accessing their food sources. When the reservation systems were originally created, it was illegal to leave the boundaries of the reservation, right? Our food sources don't give a shit about political boundaries you draw on a map. Herds migrate, right? Like plants move, right? And so leaving the reservation was a crime. You then became a hostile. It was legal to kill you. And the biggest reason we left reservation boundaries was to get to food sources. In the 20th century, you see programs like relocation and boarding schools that are further separating Native peoples from their traditional food sources. Imposition of Western agriculture. Many Native peoples were tremendous agriculturalists, right? If we hadn't been, all the settlers on the eastern seaboard would have died, right? Like they were starving when they showed up. But many tribes didn't do Western style agriculture, right? And they were adept fishers, hunters. And here in California, we would burn all the time, and people call that like a proto agriculture. But the state also wanted to impose Western agriculture, like Protestant ideals, right? The yeoman farmer. In other ways, they interfered with the transfer of food-related knowledge. When students were sent off to boarding schools, they weren't learning where their traditional hunting spots were, where their traditional fishing spots were, what all the recipes were, what are the relationships you're supposed to have with these foods. So that also worked to sever this relationship. And then environmental change, the damming of rivers, preventing salmon from reaching their ancestral territories, flooding of native lands, right? We call native lands sacrifice lands, so that places are flooded so other places can have the things they want, right? Like all of the Winnemucca lands are like underwater so that Los Angeles can have drinking water. Industrial contamination that prevents us from accessing traditional foods, but also when we put it into our bodies, it perpetuates violence through contamination. And climate change. Our food systems are changing now because of climate change. The flows in rivers are changing, ice caps are melting, etc. So as the availability of foods declined, so too have the stories, the languages, the cultural practices, interpersonal relationships, and outdoor activities implicated in those food systems. So when we talk about reclaiming foods, it's not just about the food, right? It's about the stories, the language, and the cultural practices that go with that. Okay, so what is food sovereignty? It is first defined in 1996 by La Via Campesina. They're an international group of small-scale farmers who want to articulate a common response to neoliberalism and the domination of market economies. Okay, and then in 2007, the Forum for Food Sovereignty, this definition of food sovereignty is further refined and developed. 80 different countries adopt the Declaration of Naileni, which includes the following definition. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own system and agricultural systems. And a really important part of food sovereignty is is the production of food, right? So in a lot of different documents, you'll see people have the right to access of food, right? Like access can mean a lot of different things. Access can mean one multinational corporation is making all of the food and you just have access. Food sovereignty is really ownership and determination over how food is produced, where, when, by whom. And so what is Indigenous food sovereignty and how does that differ? The first thing I will recommend is this text, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States, Restoring Cultural Knowledge, Protecting the Environment, and Regaining Health, edited by Maheshua and Hoover. It has numerous chapters from practitioners all over the United States. Excellent resource if you want to go educate yourself more on Indigenous food sovereignty. I'll just very briefly, Indigenous food sovereignty refers to a reconnection to land-based food and political systems that seek to uphold sacred responsibilities to nurture relationships with our land, culture, spirituality, and future generations. According to Carla Ray Rudolph and Stephane McLaughlin, Indigenous food sovereignty explicitly connects the health of food with the health of the land and identifies a history of social injustice as having radically reduced Indigenous food sovereignty in colonized nations. Indigenous food sovereignty can also be thought as a framework for exploring the right conditions for reclaiming the social, political, and personal health we once experienced prior to colonization. The concept of Indigenous food sovereignty is not only focused on rights to land and the ability to control a production system, but also responsibilities to and culturally, ecologically, and spiritually appropriate relationships with elements of those systems. So in Indigenous sovereignty, food sovereignty centers responsibility and relationships over just rights and access. And then the last thing, and then I will let our panelists take it away. This also comes from the book edited by Maheshua and Elizabeth Hoover, 4 Principles of Indigenous Food Sovereignty. First, the recognition that the right to food is sacred, and food sovereignty is achieved by upholding sacred responsibilities to nurture relationships with the land, plants, and animals that provide food. Second is the day-to-day participation in Indigenous food-related action at all levels. That includes individual, family, community, and region. Indigenous food sovereignty is not something we only theorize about or only write about or only produce research about. Indigenous food sovereignty is something that is enacted and lived in a day-to-day life. Third, self-determination, or the ability of communities and families to respond to their needs for culturally relevant foods and to have the freedom to make decisions over the amount and quality of food that they hunt, fish, gather, grow, and eat. And fourth, legislation and policy support to reconcile Indigenous food and cultural values with colonialist law, policies, and mainstream economic activities. One of the elephant in the room is that many of the settler states' current policies and environmental objectives are mutually exclusive with practicing an Indigenous food sovereignty, right? If you build an oil pipeline under the river, you can't support your community with fish from that same river, right? And so a lot of these activities need to end, right? So that everybody can feed themselves, right? And we all know settler colonialism is inherently unsustainable anyway. It's not about if it's going to collapse, it's about when, right? And so we need to be prepared with our food systems for when empire falls.